Welcome back to Power and Politics. Canada is sanctioning 34 individuals and entities connected to the Iranian regime. The sanctions include some leaders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and morality police. The announcement comes as reports show Iranian security forces clashing violently with students at a prominent university in Tehran. Just the latest sign of a deadly clampdown on nationwide protests that were ignited by the death in police custody of a young woman whose alleged crime was wearing her hijab improperly. Global solidarity protests took place this weekend, including across cities in Canada. In Toronto alone, 50,000 people showed up, calling for the federal government to do more to put pressure on the Iranian regime. Shuvaloy Majumdar is the head of the Foreign Policy and National Security Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and former policy director to John Baird. Thomas Juneau is a University of Ottawa international affairs professor specializing in Iran. They're both with me here in studio. It's so nice to have you here. I was saying in the break, I wish it were under different circumstances, but I feel like we've rewound the clock 4 years when we used to have these foreign policy debates often, so I'm really glad to see both of you. Shiv, I'm going to start with you. Lay out for me why your perspective is the government can do more.
Well, listen, it's been 2 years since the flight P752 had been bombed out of the sky by the Iranian Quds Force. It's been only a short time thereafter that the Parliament unanimously endorsed the idea that the IRGC be listed as a terror organization. Human rights organizations, geopolitical organizations have been advocating for accountability of the Iranian regime for years now. Nearly a decade of pressure had been applied on a regime that seemed to be bent on reform, at least in propaganda, but certainly not in real deeds. And it's coming a little too late. A lot of the actions that need to be happening, that are happening now, are welcome, but I think a lot more can happen. You wonder why the IRGC has not been listed as a terror organization. You wonder why the supreme leader, President Raisi, former Foreign Minister Zarif, have not been listed under both sanctions and terror regulations for their violations of human rights and destabilizing international security. And you wonder why PS 752 families have not received the kind of support they've deserved. They're clamoring for this support now. They've been petitioning the government to take action for years, and finally they're through the death of Mahsa Amini, which is a huge tragedy, this 22-year-old Kurdish girl, has now mobilized international opinion around these objectives.
So as Shiv raises those questions for the past week, a lot of us have been Googling, trying to figure out, okay, why is it that this stuff hasn't happened, even though, in particular, let's talk about the listing of the IRGC as a terrorist entity, even though that House of Commons vote happened in 2018. You come across a lot of articles written by you or where you're quoted, Tama. What are some of the reasons from your perspective why that might not be the most impactful thing to do? So
just to be clear, I agree with some of what Shuv was saying in the sense that the government could and should do more to pressure the Islamic Republic, to sanction some of its leaders on various grounds. And on that, I fully agree. So the news that were announced today, I think, are good, but they're a first step and there should be more. Where I disagree in practice, though not necessarily in principle, is on the issue of listing the IRGC as a whole. The idea of penalizing, sanctioning the IRGC, I think we need to do that. We've already done it, and I think there's scope to do it more within Canada and with our allies. The problem is that even though the idea of listing and sanctioning in general the IRGC is a good one, in practice, it's not clear that it's doable. In practice, sanctioning the IRGC as a whole implies monitoring thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals who were part of the IRGC, which is something that imposes a huge burden on the intelligence community, on the national security community, the RCMP and border services. And I absolutely realize that a lot of people in the media and civil society will roll their eyes when you talk about the practical side of doing things. But in practice, it matters. And in this case, even if you try to carve out exemptions to say, well, for example, if an individual was a conscript and acted as a cook in 1996 with the IRGC, you can exempt him. In theory, that's a good idea. But in practice, an individual shows up at the Canadian border and says, yeah, but I was only a cook. You need to verify that because you can't take that for granted. And then multiply that by hundreds, thousands of cases, including that in that questioning individuals who may already be in Canada as permanent residents or citizens. So the burden is massive, and it's not realistic to expect the government to be able to do it. And the key point is that that's because our sanction capacity is already overstretched. It would be nice if we had more, but we don't. That's why, in my view, to further pressure the Islamic Republic, it would be much more impactful, as you said, to continue the targeted sanctions as opposed to the more sweeping ones.
So, Shiv, does that point make sense? Does that make sense to you? Like, if the practicality of it is too onerous and the impact of it is minimized as a consequence, is it worth it to do it just in name only?
The first obligation of the federal government of Canada is to ensure the safety and the sovereignty of Canadians. In Canada, we have Iranian regime officials and their families snow-washing money through our real estate, our capital markets. We know that they have taken to propaganda in Canada. Press TV has been sanctioned today, which I think is a good step. But one of the things that we cannot hide behind is the question of being under-resourced when it's a matter of more efficient delivery of security services. There is capital, and there are people here who deserve to be sanctioned under Magnitsky sanctions, which have yet to be imposed on any Iranian official, under economic sanctions, and certainly listed as terrorists as one of two countries in which in the world, Syria and Iran, Canada has designated as a terrorist country. So resources not being able to monitor, track these things is not a sufficient excuse to deny the families of Canadians who have been murdered by the IRGC the right to access those assets that are here in this country that should be turned to them in the name of justice.
The other sort of follow-up, and I'll swing over to Thomas, around the practicality aspect of it is, and this could be, and you know better than I, because the sanction regime is different, but the U.S. has been able to list the IRGC as a terrorist entity. Under the Trump administration, there was some thought when the nuclear talk started again that President Biden would actually reverse that decision, and he ended up not doing that. So how are they able to do it and we are not?
Well, by and large, they have a far greater capacity to do it than we do. And I think one element that comes into play here is the symbolic politics of it. On the one hand, the symbol of sanctioning the IRGC, listing it as a terrorist entity in particular, is powerful. But the problem when the reality is that we don't have the capacity to fully follow through, there are consequences to that. There are consequences to our credibility. When we further sanction Iran, China, Russia, we already have a bad reputation of a country that is not able to follow through on its sanctions. Our allies know it and the bad guys know it. That's a problem. And of course the problem, the response to that problem should be more resources to actually be able to do that. But you can't generate these resources in a week or in 6 weeks. It takes a lot of time. And this government has not shown that it has the will to generate these resources.
Let me just follow up with you on that point. Isn't that in and of itself a problem, especially as our sanctions regime becomes almost like a de facto way of like the practical way we condemn bad things that happen around the world. I'm thinking of China, I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, I'm thinking of all these things in which the Magnitsky Act, which was passed, Ukraine, it becomes the primary way that the government can show its condemnation. Isn't it a big deal?
I think it's a big problem. And this government deserves a lot of blame for that. Previous governments too, for that matter, that we have always been under-resourced in our capacity to implement sanctions, to monitor. This is extremely labor-intensive, right? To monitor specific individuals, to ask questions, to figure out who's who did what in 1996 and things like that. But the reality is that's the problem we live with today. That's the lack of resources that we have. Given that reality, which will not change in the short term, I wish it would, but it won't, we're much better off going for specific targeted sanctions. Shuv was very rightly talking about the problem of regime leaders and their families who are in Canada, who study here, who launder money, who are engaged in a variety of illicit activities, pressuring members of the diaspora. That's a problem, and we should absolutely do more to counter that. But that becomes much easier given our reality of scarce resources with targeted sanctions.
And what about, Shiv, then, if, for example, that is employed and there are targeted sanctions more specifically on political leadership, is that almost like, I don't want to use the word compromise because we don't want to compromise with morals here, but is that something that could be more effective, basically?
I don't buy it's a matter of resources alone. It's a matter of political will. When this government was first elected, it went out of its way to normalize relations with Tehran rather than challenge it for the rivals that it is. They sent...
It said it wanted to look again at what that relationship would be like. And that was at a time, also just for some context, that the world was talking about the nuclear deal and what that would involve.
Not the entire world. I mean, there was a big debate about the nuclear deal.
No, I'm not taking away from that
right?
either.
And I think that there was good reasons to be skeptical of the regime's intentions then, and there was good reason to not want to try and have a good relationship with the regime, but to continue to apply the pressure that brought the regime to the nuclear negotiations in the first place. It's had 7 years to think about how they're going to track monitor, and enforce the rules of Canada in Canada, let alone a sanctions regime globally. And let's not be under any illusion here. Prior to this government's election, Canada had a wide network globally on Iranian digital and diplomatic advocacy. When Canada shut down the embassy in Tehran, it replaced it with a program that engaged millions of Iranians directly inside the country and all around the world. It had a mass inventory, perhaps the best in the world, of who the regime assets were, what they were doing around the world. This government undermined the resources toward that over the last several years and failed to prioritize our rivals the way that they deserve.
Okay, I saw you nodding to a little bit of that. Really quick final word to you, Thomas.
As much as I was critical of the Harper government's decision to shut down the embassy over there and to have an embassy, have an Iranian embassy here, I think having an embassy in Iran now would actually be useful to have a presence on the ground to see what's going on. On this, we disagree. Where I do agree is where that network of digital diplomacy, of direct diplomacy, of directly engaging with Iranians, with civil society, that was good, and that is something that we should try to reestablish.
I would say.
I'm sorry, I'm out of time. We'll have to come back and we'll do it all again. Thanks very much, both of you. I appreciate the discussion. Shuvaloy Majumdar and Thomas Juneau. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.